The Voice in the Walls, The Strange Case of Jeff, the Talking Mongoose. There are places where the ordinary dissolves into something you cannot explain. The Isle of Man, a windswept island between England and Ireland in the Irish Sea, has always been thick with folklore. But in autumn 1931, something happened there that went beyond old stories. Something that would attract investigators and journalists from around the world. Something that, nearly a century later, still has no satisfactory explanation. This is the story of Jeff, the talking mongoose who lived in the walls of an isolated farmhouse and spoke to the family for years. This is about voices in the darkness and the strange weight of living with something you cannot prove to anyone else. Picture Dalby, a hamlet on the western coast of the Isle of Man, a farmhouse called Dorlish Cashin, perched on a slope overlooking the Irish Sea. The nearest neighbors more than a mile away. No electricity, no running water, just wind and isolation. James Irving, a former piano salesman from Liverpool, had retired here with his wife Margaret and their 13-year-old daughter Voirrey. The farm never prospered. It was a hard, lonely existence. In September 1931, when Voirrey was 13 years old, the family began hearing sounds. At first, it was scratching behind the wooden paneling that lined the interior walls of the old stone farmhouse. Then came rustling, then vocal noises that sounded like a ferret or a dog or something else they could not identify. The sounds were persistent, keeping them awake at night, driving them to distraction. James Irving tried to catch whatever was making the noises. He set traps, he tried poison, he even fired his shotgun into the walls, hoping to kill whatever rodent had taken up residence there. But the creature was too clever. It avoided every trap, survived every attempt to remove it. And then something remarkable happened. James began making animal sounds at the walls, calling out names of different creatures, and whatever was behind the panels began to mimic him. It replicated each noise he made. It repeated the words he said in a high-pitched voice that was distinctly not human, but also not quite animal. Over the following weeks, the thing in the walls learned to speak more fluently. It began asking questions. It began having conversations. And eventually, it introduced itself. Its name, it said, was Jeff, spelled G-E-F, pronounced like Jeff. It claimed to be a mongoose born in New Delhi, India on June 7, 1852, which would have made it nearly 80 years old. When asked how it had come to the Isle of Man, Jeff said he was shot by Indians and somehow ended up in this remote farmhouse. He described himself as an extra clever mongoose, an earthbound spirit, a ghost in the form of a weasel, a freak with hands and feet who, if you saw him, would make you faint, be petrified, mummified, turned into stone or a pillar of salt. According to Voirrey, the only member of the family who claimed to have seen Jeff clearly, he was about the size of a small rat with yellowish fur and a large bushy tail. He made a nest for himself in a boxed partition in her bedroom, which the family called Jeff's sanctum. He would eat the food they left for him on a saucer suspended from the ceiling, taking it when he thought no one was watching. The family gave him biscuits, chocolates, and bananas. In return, Jeff told them he would guard the house, wake them if they overslept, and hunt rabbits to supplement their meager diet. And he did bring rabbits, leaving them outside the house, though skeptics would later point out that the family also owned a sheepdog named Mona, who was perfectly capable of hunting. Jeff had personality. He was witty, crude, sometimes cruel. He would sing songs and recite nursery rhymes. He claimed to speak multiple languages, though this was never verified. He would accompany the Irvings to market, staying on the other side of hedges, chatting as they walked. He ventured to neighboring farms, eavesdropped, then told the Irvings gossip, making neighbors uncomfortable when James repeated information he should not have known. He could be terrifying. "I could kill you all, but I will not," he once said. He threw objects, he woke the family with chaos. When chastised, he would pretend he had been poisoned and was dying. He had a fondness for voyeury, but treated Margaret with hostility. He once called out, "Read it out, you fat-headed gnome." He proclaimed, "I will split the atom. I am the fifth dimension. I am the eighth wonder of the world." James was not content to keep it quiet. He wrote letters describing Jeff's antics, kept detailed diaries. Word spread. Locals called him the Dalby Spook. By 1932, tabloids picked up the story. The farmhouse became the center of international attention. Journalists arrived. Some heard the voice, others left convinced it was a hoax. But Jeff was shy around strangers, often refusing to speak when outsiders were present. In July 1935, Harry Price, one of Britain's most famous paranormal investigators, traveled to Dawlish Cashen with his friend Richard Lambert, the editor of the BBC magazine The Listener. Price had built his reputation on exposing fraudulent mediums and debunking supernatural claims, and he approached the Jeff case with skepticism. When they arrived, the Irvings told them that Jeff had conveniently disappeared. Price tried to coax the Mongoose into making an appearance. He spoke into the walls, pleading with Jeff to say something, to make a sound, to throw an object, anything. But Jeff remained silent throughout their entire visit. Price did collect samples that the Irvings claimed belonged to Jeff: strands of hair, paw prints pressed into modeling clay, and an impression of tooth marks. He sent the hair to naturalist Philip Duncan, who identified it as dog hair, most likely from the family's sheepdog Mona. The paw prints were sent to Reginald Pocock at the Natural History Museum. Pocock could not match them to any known animal, though he noted they might conceivably have been made by a dog. The prints showed a strange disparity between the size of the front and rear paws, with the front paws being remarkably large for an animal that the Irvings claimed was only about 30 centimeters long. But this was consistent with the family's description of Jeff having oversized, almost human-like hands. Price and Lambert co-authored a book about their investigation called The Haunting of Cashen's Gap, published in 1936. They were careful not to declare the case definitively a hoax, but they also did not support the Irvings' claims. Price noted that the farmhouse had double walls of wooden paneling that created considerable interior airspace, making the whole house one great speaking tube, with walls like soundboards. It would have been easy, he suggested, for someone inside the house to project their voice and make it seem like it was coming from elsewhere. Another investigator, the Hungarian-born psychoanalyst Nandor Fodor, visited in 1937 and spent a week at the farmhouse. Like Price, he never saw or heard Geff during his stay, but Fodor approached the case differently. He was less interested in whether Geff was physically real and more interested in what Geff represented psychologically. Fodor theorized that Geff was not a deliberate hoax, but rather a manifestation of repressed psychological stress within the Irving household. He wrote that Geff was an externalized voice, a projection of subconscious impulses, particularly from James Irving, a man who had once enjoyed a comfortable life in Liverpool and now found himself isolated and struggling on a failing farm. Fodor believed poltergeists were not spirits of the dead, but psychic phenomena created by living people under psychological strain. Before leaving, Fodor wrote Geff a goodbye letter, saying he was very disappointed Geff had not spoken to him, but that he believed Geff to be a very good and generous mongoose and that he had brought chocolates and biscuits. The most persistent suspicion is that Voy was behind it. She was 13 when it began, a lonely, intelligent girl with few friends. Some locals claimed she had ventriloquism skills. An Isle of Man Examiner reporter allegedly caught her making noises. But ventriloquism must be learned and practiced. No one was teaching Voy, and there were documented occasions when Geff's voice was heard while Voy was clearly visible and far away. Harold Dennis, sent by Price, heard Geff's voice describing his clothing from behind the wainscoting while Voy was visibly 100 feet away, feeding hens.
On another occasion, Dennis and James were outside, 80 paces from the house, knowing Voyre was indoors. They heard Geff's voice calling to them, close by. James also claimed in his diaries that Geff spoke to him when he was completely alone. If true, Voyre could not have been the source. The case divided people. The family gained no money. The notoriety damaged them. They sold the farm at a loss in 1945 after James's death because it had a reputation for being haunted. Voyre suffered most. Other children called her the spook. She said Geff had kept her from marrying. In 1939, she moved to England, desperate to escape the shadow he had cast. In 1970, journalist Walter McGraw tracked down Voyre, then 52. She had refused interviews for decades. She told him, "It was not a hoax, and I wish it had never happened. Father was wrapped up in it. It was such a wonderful phenomenon that he had to tell people." When asked about Geff, she said, "Yes, there was a little animal who talked and did all those other things. He said he was a mongoose. I do wish he had left us alone." Voyre died in 2005, never having changed her story. So what was Geff? Was he a real animal with inexplicable abilities? A ghost or poltergeist? A psychological projection born from isolation and stress? A hoax perpetrated by a lonely teenager with her father's encouragement? A shared delusion that an entire family somehow maintained for years? We do not know. We likely never will. What we do know is that the Irving family insisted, for the rest of their lives, that something was in that house with them, something that spoke, something that laughed and sang, and threw objects and told them secrets. Whether that something was flesh or spirit or imagination, it was real to them, and the weight of living with it, of being unable to prove it to anyone else, of being mocked and doubted and called liars, marked all three of them for the rest of their lives. The farmhouse at Dorlish Cashin was eventually demolished in 1971. The stones were scattered. The walls where Geff supposedly lived were torn down and carried away, and with them went any chance of ever knowing the truth. All that remains now are the letters James Irving wrote, the books the investigators published, the newspaper articles that sensationalized the story, and the testimony of a family who swore they were not lying. Sometimes the darkness keeps its secrets, sometimes the questions outlive the answers, and sometimes in the lonely places where isolation presses in and the wind never stops, people hear voices they cannot explain. Whether those voices come from outside or from some deep place within themselves, they are real to the people who hear them, and that is its own kind of truth. If you found this exploration of one of the strangest cases in paranormal history compelling, I would appreciate it if you would take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are more mysteries waiting to be told, more stories that sit uncomfortably between the possible and impossible, and I will be here to guide you through them. Thank you for listening with the attention these strange, unsettling stories deserve.